Hello and welcome to The Conversation, the very last edition of this week as we start 2020 with the same show. I am Sibusisiwe, Nyanda. And of course today, what would the show be if we weren't talking about what you're talking about on social media? We're looking at that just released 2019 Corruption Perception Index that was released, of course, by Transparency International. And it's been criticized by the governments of the likes of Somalia and Nigeria for being out of tune with current realities. That's at least what our African governments are alleging. Now, what is the basis of its rankings? Why is Somalia still rated the most corrupt nation in the world? That conversation starts now. And of course, joining me today on The Conversation are Chukwudi Ezugwu, who's a public affairs analyst, and Peter Adesina, who's a politics reporter. Both of them familiar on The Conversation and definitely here to help us get a much more in-depth and engaging discussion, I hope. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to take a very, very short break. After this, we get into the intro of this discussion. Stay with us. So if you aren't familiar with this Corruption Perceptions Index or Transparency International, you're in the right place. We're going to start right at the beginning. Who is Transparency International? They're an international non-governmental organization based in Berlin, Germany, and it was established in 1993. Its main aim when it was formed was to expose corruption and to prevent criminal activities that arise from this behavior. It publishes this Global Corruption Barometer as well as the Corruption Perceptions Index, which of course is what we're discussing today, because the latest edition was released on Thursday this week and received huge reactions across Africa. It started trending on social media, and these are some of its key findings. Take a look at this clip coming directly from Transparency International. Take a look.
Transparency International presents the Corruption Perceptions Index 2019. Using a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is highly corrupt and 100 is very clean, the CPI analyzes public sector corruption in 180 countries and territories around the world. The top countries are New Zealand and Denmark, while the bottom countries are Somalia, South Sudan, and Syria. However, when it comes to improving on corruption, the majority of countries are stagnating. Our analysis shows how the stream of big money in politics is linked to higher rates of corruption. In fact, low CPI scores are also associated with higher concentrations of power among the rich, while poorer citizens have little to no political influence. But even countries with high CPI scores aren't free of corruption. Multiple scandals show that transnational corruption is often facilitated by countries at the top of the index, countries where the proceeds of corruption are stashed.
Okay, so the most glaring thing I think here for all of us is that most of the higher ranking countries are either European countries or countries in North America, and then the lower ranking ones are African or Middle Eastern countries. Now, having said that, the links where these corrupt behaviors are being picked up, the link always takes us back to either European institutions or to American institutions. So how balanced is this report? If we think about just the same week as we were talking about the CPI, we were also talking about Angola, Isabel dos Santos, and the corrupt behavior where she's concerned. And it was big fish that were involved: PwC, Boston Consultancy, as well as Eurobig, which have all conveniently distanced themselves from her. So is this really a balanced report if we're, separating these institutions from the governments within which they operate?
I think it's important to look at the indexes really very clear. They have remained constant over the years. So if we take a critical look at the indexes, one would say you can, to a considerable degree, say there's a balance. But unfortunately, Nikita Khrushchev, one-time leader of the USSR, once said politicians are one and the same everywhere. They promise to build a bridge even where there is no water. So you have people who are trying to take advantage of the situation. What they do is look at loopholes and say, well, if these people are not going to clean house, what we will do is take advantage of the system. That's why you see the link between, those at the top and those that are below. It's all some sort of like an organized system where you continue to reinforce failure while, you know, at the end, you just identify one or two persons and say, well, it's their fault, it's their business, it has nothing to do with us. But we must critically examine all of the factors. And the truth is, I mean, in 2020, we've gotten to the point where we would begin to question all those who gather this data, ask all the questions, and say, this is what we have arrived at. Because if it is convenient for you to overlook, like, for example, so much has been said about money laundering, and it would seem that you're looking the other way, then there is a problem. If the idea is to identify all of these, because the very essence of government is transparency and openness, then we must begin to look at all of the issues so that at the end of the day, confidently, you don't have countries dismissing and saying, or governments dismissing and saying, you know, we do not care about this because we perceive that it is not in our favor.
Yeah. So, Peter, you look particularly at public policies.
Yes.
How much bearing do you think reports like this have generally on the behaviors of governments? We've seen some that have been seen to respond in terms of what they do in the institutions after these reports. And then, I mean, of course, this week we've had governments of African countries responding. But it's one thing to respond, it's another thing entirely to do something where policy creation and policy amendment is concerned. How much bearing does this have?
I think it depends on the government and what they intend to achieve. You talk about responses from some governments, African governments particularly. What kind of response are they giving to it? Some are living in complete denial of the event. Some are questioning the reputation of Transparency International. Some are claiming to say that, oh, we are not aware of what is happening. So the kind of response we've gotten is, for me, is very discouraging. Whether Transparency International is a foreign-based institution or not, the reality is that Africa is a very corrupt continent. I mean, these things are not, you know, they don't exist in a vacuum. And if you look at the CPI, it measures perception, not necessarily acts of corruption in itself. They speak to business experts and everyday people who are also business people in the country. If you look at Nigeria specifically, at every interaction with the Nigerian government, there's corruption all over the place. Only recently, when the JAM, the institution that conducts exam for matriculation into universities, announced that students who are intending to get admission should get a national identity number, you know, for them to register for this examination. It was a process fraught with corruption. People who went to offices in Lagos here, for instance, to get this national identity number were told by officials at the offices to offer bribes. In exchange, these were reported by multiple media organizations in Nigeria. All of these contribute to perception of corruption in countries like Nigeria and also Africa as a whole. So I think that the governments need to begin to reevaluate how they respond to these things. It's not necessarily an attack from foreign organizations. And when you set up anti-corruption organizations, how independent are they to function? How are they stripped from politics, and how are they focused on public policy as an institution?
I'm going to step in there because I like that you emphasize that it's about perceptions, right? Let's look at a country like Botswana and a country like Rwanda. They're rated quite highly compared to their other counterparts. Having said that, though, there's a lot of critique around the absence of a democratic spirit in Rwanda as well as Botswana. So what is actually the fundamental difference between those African countries that did well and those that didn't?
I think it's essentially about leadership. To a considerable degree, you have people who would decide to play politics rather than address the issues. Now, it's easy for politicians to go to town saying it's our opponents that have come up with these numbers and are spreading the stories. But the truth is, the reality that Africans have to contend with is that there is really gross incompetence and irresponsibility in governance. And you must be able to address these issues rather than, like I said, live in denial. How do you address these issues? I mean, if you look at the principle of social contract, it is essentially because we all cannot be in government, certain people would hold leadership positions in trust and do their best to see that they work in the best interest of the collective. But what you have is people who just, you know, dip their hands into the cookie jar and enrich themselves to the fourth generation unborn. Really very, very unfortunate and irresponsible. Now, in the end, these people just try to protect their image while the vast majority live in abject poverty. Now, what governments must do, I mean, you take a cue. When we talk about democracy in its very practice, where it is government of the people, by the people, and for the people, then we would identify certain anomalies in different governments. But if we're talking about the operation of government, if we're talking about how government is administered and how you expect to see outcome or result with the work of government, then these are the issues that we should, we should place our attention on.
What are the ones performing well? What are they doing well?
I think if I may answer that directly, I think that governments like governments of Rwanda, for instance, Paul Kagame is very particular about the image of Rwanda outside the shores of African continent. That's true. And so there is a way. So one of the major limitations of the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index is that it can be gamed, right? If you patronize the business community in your country, if you also try to get the experts on your side, when you come to do these surveys, they can say very nice things about the country, even though it might not be a good reflection of what is on ground. And if you look at government like Rwanda, who have suffered accusation of manipulating data in their country, there was a time that there was a report on The Economist accusing Paul Kagame's government of manipulating data. So I think that the governments of Africa who are doing well, this is not to disprove or to say they have not done anything at all, but I think they pay particular attention to these indexes and also these surveys, and they make direct efforts to alter the result. Rwanda, of course, it's a heavily, policed state. Paul Kagame is one that is not known to enable critique or to... He dismisses reports that are unfavorable to his government. He encourages those that are favorable to his government. So I won't be surprised if this, in Rwanda particularly, is gained, because if you look at data coming from Rwanda, from independent sources, corruption is very rife in the country. Underdevelopment is also rife, and there is a whole lot of poverty in Rwanda.
Okay, I'm going to put a pin on that discussion. We're going to take a very short break, but remember, you can talk to us on social media. We're at News Central TV on Facebook or on Twitter. We're on Instagram. We're also on YouTube, where I hope you're watching us right now. Use our hashtag #NCTheConversation. Tell us what your thoughts are on the CPI. Is it imperialist, like some of our leaders are saying? Is it a falsehood, like many of our other leaders are saying? Or are we in denial as African people about what it means to practice good governance? Tell us what you think on social media. We're taking a very short break. After this, the conversation does continue. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is The Conversation, and I'm Sibusisiwe Nyanda. If you're just joining us, we're still discussing that much talked about CPI of 2019, and it's listed Somalia still as the most corrupt nation in the world, and many African countries are still seen to be performing badly. Remember, this is a conversation with you. We are on social media. Use our hashtag #NCTheConversation. Okay, so we're going to read a response here, right? One of the most glaring takeouts from the CPI has been that Sub-Saharan Africa is the lowest. The average is 32 for most of our Sub-Saharan countries, right? And there's been a response, particularly from the Nigerian government, where this is concerned. Attorney General and Minister of Justice Abubakar Malami said the following. I'm going to quote him directly here. He said, "In terms of the fight against corruption, we've been doing more. We've done more, and we will continue to do more out of inherent conviction and a desire on our part to fight against corruption, devoid of any extraneous considerations relating to the rating by Transparency International. Our resolve to fight corruption is inherent and indeed devoid of any extraneous considerations," right? Now, okay, I'm going to start with, we are going to do more. How do you begin to quantify what more means in relation to other countries? Because it isn't to say that the report itself doesn't pay attention to countries that have moved up in the rankings. If we're talking about your Ghana, for example, where they have decreased, they've declined. And then Angola has improved since the introduction of a new president. So how do we quantify more? Because Nigeria says that they're doing better, but the rating doesn't say that. So how do we, in this particular context, begin to quantify what we will do more means?
It's the government's... It starts with the government stop being hypocritical. There's a lot of hypocrisy about the Nigerian government. You also look at the anti-corruption agency, particularly the EFCC. How independent is the agency, and how independent is it perceived by the public to be? Malami is the AGF. The former AGF in the last administration is presently in court, taken to court by the EFCC over the Malabu oil scandal. That dents trust in government. The EFCC's chairman, Ibrahim Magu, acted for 4 years because he lacked bipartisan Senate approval for him to occupy that position. But the president stuck with him still. Provoking accusations that perhaps because he has partisan leaning, that is why the federal government has decided to keep him in that position. And of course, it didn't help matters. There was a time he went on a television program wearing a campaign lapel of the All Progressive Congress of President Muhammadu Buhari. Now, if you had an agency of that with that sensitivity, and then you go on a TV program ostensibly campaigning for a candidate, that shows that perhaps you are introducing bias into your operations. All of these put together contributes to low perception and of course low trust in government, particularly when they claim to be fighting corruption. So I think the Nigerian government needs to do more in terms of how they operate and how the people perceive their operations.
Yeah.
In Nigeria, there's so much impunity, so much so that anything goes. People go on TV and they, almost admit wrongdoing, and they walk away with it because they have the right political backing and they also have the right political process. And we must not forget to also that corruption is not just about money laundering or politics. It is when you use government position or office for your own private gain. So you look at Nigerian government across the board, and you look at other agencies who people do particularly pay attention to. You look at the immigration system, for instance. You look at Nigerian Ports Authority, for instance. You look at every offices that is controlled by the federal government. Even look at federal education institutions, the federal universities. What kind of practice is rampant there? A reporter, Kiki Modi, released a report about the University of Lagos, the federal university, about how some lecturers, approach students for sex in return for grades. This is something that is rampant, and this is corruption too. What is the government doing to clamp down on these practices? And their processes, is it clear? The people perceive it as clear, and did they follow up on all of these things? All of this add up, and I'm sure that if the Nigerian government is serious about curbing it, they'll start looking at all of these things one by one.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there. I was hoping to be able to come to you, but we are fast running out of time. So let's take a look at some tweets around this discussion. Let's see what some people had to say on social media. More importantly, government representatives. We start there with the EFCC that says they slam TI over poor ratings on Nigeria. They say it's baseless, illogical, and they restate their commitment to the fight against corruption. Now, they vehemently condemned in strong terms the 2019 CPI that was recently released. So that's essentially a link to an article, but that's the sentiment. We insist that the rating is a far cry from evidence, strides and achievements so far accomplished by the anti-graft agency in the fight against corruption, right? So I'm going to actually come to that because we've just mentioned, if I look here at the Seychelles, for example, right, the reason why they continue to do well, they say they've got several anti-corruption laws. They recently introduced an access to information law. They have a newly established anti-corruption commission. They have dialogue between civil society and the government, and they've created national platforms. Now, it's one thing to create these institutions, which Nigeria has plenty of. It's another thing entirely to have these exist in a healthy fashion that supports the spirit of democracy. So what do we do beyond that? We've created these institutions. They don't seem to be working as they should be. Civil society organizations often are stifled in terms of their opinion. What then is the next step? And when we have these indices being released, we shove them off, we shrug them off. Now,
it would appear like we expend more energy discussing the problems and trying to convince the people that we have the answers rather than addressing the issues. And it's really very, very unfortunate. I mean, public officials must understand that first, they owe those they represent, the duty of discharging their responsibility. Everyone has a job description. You don't just, whether it's this party or that party, and turn to the defender of the universe. Like he mentioned, the chairperson of the ruling party, at various campaign rallies said, if you join us, you will be considered a saint. Now, when people hear this, it makes no sense whatsoever. So it's not about, saying we will, we shall, and we're not seeing any results. It's important that you set up institutions that would work independent of whatever body language or perception of the leader. And most importantly, we must see results. I mean, we should be building more prisons and have people in jail. So we understand that these people, are paying for the crime. Now, what is really very, very sad is if you ask every average Nigerian, they'll tell you, this is Nigeria. This is what's expected. And if a government for 5 years say that this is what we're trying to achieve, and people still feel it's Nigeria, you would get away with it if you know one or two persons, then it's an absolute waste of time. Okay. Very, very quickly, yay, nay. This is a yay or nay question. In response to those who say these reports are created by organizations that are neo-imperialists, should we be creating our own indices? Yay, nay? No.
That's an answer. That is an answer on its own, and that's all we have time for in this edition of The Conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, it continues on social media. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram to join in, and of course keep up with all the latest via our website www.newscentral.africa. Until our next conversation, I'm Sibusisiwe. Thank you to my guests, and thank you to you for tuning in. It's goodbye from us.